Tonight's lecture topic is the sources of knowledge. Classical philosophical issue, how do we know? And in the initial stages of Greek philosophy, there were those who held that nothing can be known. They were known as skeptics who maintained that nothing can be known. But notice that having said that, one is already involved in self-contradiction. If one is very sure that nothing can be known, then that's a proposition which he is affirming as true, in which case he claims to know something, namely that nothing can be known. The only way to save it is to bracket afterward and say nothing can be known, bracket, except this, bracket. Well, then the question is, by what magical technique did one come to such vast, comprehensive knowledge? And if there is a way of coming to know that, why aren't there ways of coming to know anything else? In the same mode, by the way, Aristotle made it clear that categorical negations are very difficult to defend. I will give you a simple example. I can say confidently, as I stand here, that there are some keys in the Oak Hills Chapel. I am feeling them at the moment with my right hand. But if I say to you a categorical negation, namely, there is no key in the entire Oak Hills Chapel, how thorough an investigation must I have undertaken? Not only do I have to examine every part of the chapel and every little technique behind the curtains, I have to even rip off some of the plastic here and there to make sure nobody hid a key under that. Not only that, I have to examine it simultaneously, lest while I am checking one corner of the chapel, somebody has put a key in another behind my back. This is why the position, there is no God in the universe, is a dogmatic assertion. It presupposes that someone has examined the entire universe simultaneously and found out there's no such person as God. That takes some thorough experimentation, which is why perhaps President Kimball said a wise thing when the cosmonauts came back some years ago, having been out in space for the first time, and said, there's no God out there. Well, we always told you, there is no God. We didn't see any God. And Brother Kimball's reply was, if you had stepped outside your capsule, you would have. There is, of course, a position intellectually, often called agnosticism, which means technically that you don't know. Gnostic in Greek means to know, and usually is associated with a special way of knowing. Agnostic is the suspension of that. Not saying, I know there is nothing, etc., but rather, I am in a suspended mode of judgment. I don't say the evidence goes this way or this way. I don't know. Now, sometimes that can be accompanied by an attitude that's opposite of another. You can say, I don't know, and I couldn't care less. Or you can say, I don't know, but I am rather interested in finding out. If someone tells you that a certain rope will support 200 pounds and you're about to use it in mountain climbing and you weigh 150, you might want to check out in special ways whether that 200 pounds really is a correct estimate of the strength of the rope. Now, in the classical tradition, there are 5 main appeals or approaches to the question, what is the dominant or predominant source of our understanding and knowledge? Reason, which results in many different theories called rationalism. Sense experience, which philosophically is called empiricism. Authority, which is ultimately parasitic to the other modes of knowing, but taking the word of others, and that's refined into convictions about who are the experts and how do we decide whether they are experts. Intuition, which is a kind of grab bag for any other approach to knowing that leaves out of account reason or sense or authority. And then finally, we can speak of a fifth mode of knowing, which modern philosophers, some of them call phenomenological awareness. The idea is essentially that there is a deep kind of introspection which one can achieve by closing his eyes and looking within. So those are the five, and I know of no exceptions in the entire panorama of philosophical and or theological thought that doesn't come down somewhere on all five of those, either saying it doesn't apply in this case or it does. Let's look for a few moments at reason, which as traditionally understood often has been allied with mathematical formulations. And this begins at least no later than Plato, who held that the study of mathematics was, in a sense, the province of the finest minds in the Republic. Plato defined his Republic as having three kinds of people. The philosopher kings, as he put it, who were about 1 in 1,000. Then the artisans and other, we would say, blue-collar types in our culture. And then he left room for the military as a sort of separate category of human being. The philosopher king goes through a process of dialectic, according to Plato, and he was convinced that clear mathematical insight is the highest kind of knowledge and tells us the ultimate truth for two reasons. One, it is certain. It can be known to be true and certain. And second, it gets us closest to what Plato thought are the most real things in the universe, namely the pure ideas or forms. So he recommended, commended, and apparently himself mastered what he could of mathematical rigor. Now, I said that these things could be known to be certain by reason or pure reason. There are philosophers today who would argue that that is so, if it is so, simply because mathematics represent posits or definitions, and we start by certain assumptions which cannot be established on any other grounds, sometimes called axioms in a mathematical system, and that one can redefine his terms and thus change mathematics. Therefore, we're dealing with conventions and not with truth. This is a widespread view among so-called analytic philosophers. In this connection, perhaps you've all had an exposure to at least some plane and even solid geometry. That, to me, in my own student days, seemed to make the most sense. My interest in geometry was in part that it seemed to me clear, common sense, and that it was a mathematics of physical reality. Triangles exist in the real world, and so do circles. A triangle has three sides, and a circle has a line that is equidistant at every point from the exact middle. But notice again, if you take the conventional view of posits, you point out that this again is definition. There were two questions on an exam during my high school days that were supposed to be unanswerable, and I answered them both. One was, how far can you run in a forest? And I wrote, halfway. After that, you're running out. How long is a piece of string? A piece of string is twice as long as the distance from the middle to one end. Sound. But what does that tell you? It doesn't tell you how long the piece of string is. It doesn't tell you how big the forest is. So there is a tendency all through modern analytic thought to separate mathematical posits, which are considered conventional, and empirical data, which is the foundation of science. Now, in fact, though I'm no historian of science, there seems to me to be, in our generation, a kind of compromise in the sciences between classical rationalism and classical empiricism. The recognition that we do and profitably do use mathematics in our dealing with data, And at the same time, the recognition that ultimately, if you want to know about external reality, you must derive what you know from sense data. In the time of the so-called continental rationalists, and we're talking here about Descartes and Leibniz and Spinoza, who were opposed, not exactly in time and space, but by their views, by three other major philosophers, all of them British, namely John Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. The rationalists took the position, and I'm now paraphrasing Leibniz, that everything is rational. The rational is real, and the real is rational. And they foresaw in their hopes a time when any question you can ask, and this has to do with questions of reality, known as metaphysics, questions of ethics, having to do with the good and the bad and obligation, and even questions of beauty, could be settled and resolved simply by saying, let us calculate. Leibniz didn't live in the time of computers, but if he had, he would have held that ultimately all truth can be processed through computers. They can tell us the ultimate answers to all questions. Well, no contemporary philosopher that I know would go that far with the power of reason. In the case of the empiricists, the position was, nothing is in your mind that was not first in the senses. Everything you know has been derived from sense experience and then combinations you make of that in your mind. And Berkeley, who went farther than either of the other two, and one wonders whether his motives ultimately were philosophical or theological, because as you will shortly see, Berkeley has a very strange argument for God. Berkeley went to the position that exactly the contrary of common sense is the case. Namely, we believe that the sense data we're having from that piano is because there is a piano and our eyes encounter the piano and give us piano sense data. He held that we as percipients project all reality, except for the exception, namely God. That was all put down in a famous limerick, to wit, there once was a man who said, God must find it exceedingly odd when he sees that this tree must continue to be when there's no one about in the quad. Now here's the reply. Dear sir, your astonishment's odd. I am always about in the quad. That's why the tree will continue to be, since observed by yours faithfully, God. Well, I suggest to you our heritage is naive realism. The piano is really there. Your sense data is caused by the piano. And philosophers who deny that nevertheless show up every week and pick up their check. So, we have reason and sense data. Let me pursue a bit, though, the terrible problems that have arisen from the question of how reliable are the data of sense. And the quandary that philosophers have dealt with for centuries is known as the egocentric predicament. And what is that? Well, how will you be able to compare the data that is being delivered from the piano with the piano as it is in itself? And the argument is, since you can never get outside of your sense data to have sense data about the sense data, you are simply locked in your own circle and don't know if the sense data does in fact relate correctly to the given stimulus. Well, philosophers have argued this specifically with reference to mirage and illusion, and even the difficulties we all experience with our eyes. But you see, the very fact that we call a mirage and don't get out of the car in Nevada and go and find the water is a tip-off that we already know from experience, that the closer you get to what you thought was water, the closer is the revelation that it isn't. So there are such things as illusions. We learn through experience to discern reality from illusion. As for our eyes, well, I once had the experience after a surgery process on my eye of having a patch, and when I took the patch off, one eye showed something as green and the other eye as a different color. So my eyes were contradicting each other. Now, amazingly, and eventually they got together again. But a philosopher out of the empirical tradition would raise the question, how do you know that you see colors? You, the majority of you, see colors in one way, but there are those sitting here tonight who are colorblind, quote. How do we know they are not seeing colors as they are, and the majority as they are not? Well, that's like asking another and similar question. How do you know that last night while you were asleep, everything in the universe didn't double in size? Typical empirical question. Answer, we don't. But, on the other hand, the experience of trying to get sense data into harmony with reason and mathematical posits is the very quest that is now defined as natural science. And Immanuel Kant inherited the two streams I'm talking about, the continental rationalists and the British empiricists, and tried to effect a compromise. But that also is a strange one, because he holds there are no concepts without percepts, but that percepts are not blind, concepts are, and that you have a kind of Johnny Verbeck machine in your head. Any Boy Scouts here who learned to sing Johnny Verbeck's Machine? Never heard of it. How does it go? Now, all the cats and dogs in the neighborhood go through Johnny Verbeck's machine and come out sausage. Isn't that the basic idea? Well, Johnny Verbeck's machine takes all of the data. It goes through what Kant calls, and don't be put off again by jargon, through the transcendental unity of apperception. And that process even imposes on the data space and time. And then you have what's left, which is called knowledge. Kant also made a radical distinction between analytic propositions, which are true by definition, and synthetic propositions, as he called them, which come from sense data. Now, I mentioned authority as a source of knowledge, and perhaps it would have been wise to begin with it, but you remember I said it's parasitic, meaning that it has to piggyback, ultimately, on other sources. The classical view that one ought to accept the word of others in order to understand truth is the classical tradition in Roman and Greek Catholicism, where either the ultimate authority is pontifical utterance as Pope, or, in the case of the Greek Orthodox, the Supreme Patriarch. And it is taught, though with some important qualifications, but you've heard this, that the pontiff is infallible in matters of faith and morals. Now, when you get into the documents themselves, you will find that that's a fairly late decision in the history of the movement, and secondly, it is qualified. He has that degree of infallibility in matters of faith and morals, which it was intended by Christ that his personal vicar on earth have. Now, notice the way that's worded. It doesn't spell out what that degree is. One could say, having heard the statement, he has that degree of infallibility. Yes, he does, namely none. But, of course, the intent is that it's more than none. But the Pope is careful not to issue encyclicals that settle matters of faith and morals without a great deal of consultation, and usually, even then, cautiously. Nevertheless, that's often used as the supreme example of a case of, I am the authority, and when the question is, why should you accept my word? The proper answer is, because I say so. You should know who I am. I am the one who knows these things. Now, Protestantism, having had some hard experience of various abuses of authority, ended up throwing out the concept of authority entirely, except that each individual is entitled and should be encouraged to make his own decisions about what the Bible, which they then hardened on, going from a living voice to a written book, he has the individual responsibility of saying, my conscience tells me this is what it means. And that, of course, has resulted in a wilderness of sects and divisions. There isn't time for me to point out what I think could be, in a careful essay, that the two proper streams in those traditions, recognizing the reality and the importance of the individual and his own judgment, and at the same time recognizing the need for authority in certain important matters, the harmony of those without the extremes is found in the church to which you belong. Authority can ultimately be challenged, but the question can be put, how do you know that you are an authority? How did you find out what should be said on a given subject? And sooner or later, the authority has to resort to some other mode, either to reason or sense experience, or, if you will, intuition. And that's what actually happens under challenge. Then the question is, well, if you could find out that way, and through those sources, why shouldn't I? Well, then someone wants to say in certain quarters, but I am privileged, I have privileged access. Now, this is a way, for example, that a medical doctor will answer you when he gives you his prescription, and you say, wait a minute, how do I know, A, that you understand fully the proper diagnosis of my condition? B, how do you know that this prescription will work? And C, how did you get this authority in the first place? And he will usually reply, well, I've trained for quite a while, and I had a good deal of experience, not all of it good, in dealing with your kind of problem, and it worked in the past, and we're making an inductive leap that it will work in the future. So authorities sooner or later have to resort to some other source of knowing. Typically, when one evaluates authorities, it boils down to three main categories. Sometimes authority is considered authority if it has been around a long time. If one can claim a venerable and ancient tradition for a certain set of ideas, then that appeals. Strangely, the opposite effect sometimes works. The latest authority is the person who rejects the classical tradition, and this is the new and the novel and the latest. On the other hand, there is the issue of prestige. Just the fact that a person has made a mark or has made a contribution or has won a Nobel Prize often leads us to say, well, that's the person I should listen to on other things too. But that can be a mistake. The fact that one is the master of a given titration in a chemistry lab doesn't necessarily help us know whether he's an authority in matters of marriage and divorce. I think it was Josh Billings who once said that the problem in the world was not really ignorance. It was the number of things people knew that just were not so. Prestige also goes with being in the public eye. And that's why advertisers are very anxious constantly to find an important figure who was on television last Sunday and have him endorse whatever product. And there is some connection between asking a man named Jordan to recommend a certain kind of basketball shoes. But I've often wondered what the connection is between presenting a beautiful woman as the recommender of spark plugs for your new car. I don't know that there is any connection. And then sometimes the way to deal with questions of how do you justify accepting a certain authority is, well, look at all the other authorities too. You have a number of people who all say the same thing. Good. That's the foundation of the ancient saying that 50 million Frenchmen can't be wrong. But as a matter of fact, they sometimes are. So again, piling up authority may or may not in the end justify acceptance unless, again, they have come to the knowledge they are now teaching from independent sources. Now, we turn to the other more ambiguous area, which I'm calling intuition, and which covers a multitude of approaches. Let me say in passing that I do hear frequently the expression in our culture, that's woman's intuition. And the notion is that women somehow have something going that men don't. And at this late stage of my life, I'm willing to acknowledge this. I just capitulate. Maybe the skeptics would say women are just more shrewd at guessing, but there seems to be something going on in the way a woman is wired. I'm stepping into very dangerous ground here. That's different than a man. And we're into left brain, right brain discussions these days. I don't know how adequate those will ultimately become, but again, there is something about the insight, flashy kind of quick insight that a woman has, and it takes a man a week to come around to it by his ponderous second-guessing and analyzing and balancing of data. A mother who's had a newborn child is often told by the doctor when she starts asking all the questions you can ask, just follow your own inward voice. Just go with what you feel. You've been playing with dolls since you were 2. Just go with that. And that's turned out to be pretty good advice. Or take the question that every girl in her teens, maybe earlier, asks her mother, namely, how do you know when you're in love? I don't know all the answers, but I know that often a mother says, well, now, dear, I know what love is, but I can't tell you how you will know, but when you are in love, you will know. Ever since the days of Adam and Eve, it seems to work. I mean, it turns out that somehow there is that moment when, without ratiocination or the application of mathematics, a girl just knows she's in love. Well, there are those who hold that the posits of mathematics are known intuitively. Aristotle talked once of what he called intuitive induction. It is the process of induction that enables contemporary television gurus to figure out how many people were watching a certain program at a certain time. They didn't call 30 million people. They called a fair sample, as they believe, a cross-section carefully chosen from all different backgrounds and differences of income, etc., and then said, what program are you watching? Having talked to 2,000, they then concluded that the same proportion of the sample were watching throughout the country. And these ratings matter a great deal, and shows are either alive or dead based upon the extrapolation. But the problem of how you justify induction itself is a long-standing and deep problem. Everyone supposes that the sun will come up tomorrow because it came up this morning. And the number of repetitions seems to increase our confidence that it will come up. Yes, today, tomorrow, and even 100 years from now. But see, there are experiences in life when the more a certain thing has happened, the less likely it is ever to happen again. Now, this is a David Hume parable. And let's imagine a hen who stands and says, look, every morning for the last week, we hear a little knock at the door, and we hear a squeak, and in comes so-and-so, and he spreads out chicken feed, and we eat it. So we have reached the point that when we hear the door open, we begin to salivate, if chickens salivate. But how do you know that he's going to come tomorrow and bring food? How do you know that? And they say, fool, skeptic, idiot. He's come every morning. We can expect it. Yes, well, Monday next, the door opens and he comes in and chops their heads off, and they go to market. Hume's conclusion was that what we call inductive knowledge is simply a habit of expectation, and the universe may surprise us at any time. We have a habit, but the habit isn't justified. Now, others have tried in vain to develop a better rationale for induction. But back to my point about intuition. Some say mathematics is known by intuition, and some say that the posits or the elementary inductive processes are known by intuition. Some hold that you can have a priori judgments, which are both empirical and true, but these are intuitive. Is the following an example? I know for sure that tomorrow at high noon in Manhattan, it will either rain or it will not rain. Now, is that an informative statement? I think I saw it in Peanuts. He said, my dog is a very smart dog. When I say to him, either go out or come in, he either goes out or comes in. Is that informative? No. The point is that intuition gives us things that we don't know how we know, and sometimes these confound our other modes of knowing. I have a friend, and I hadn't better name him, who has been all his life an articulate exponent of anti-religion. He is a brilliant scientific naturalist who is convinced that religion as a ball of wax is delusion and has been the enemy of the progress of mankind. If I said to him, and I did one day, do you leave any room in your perspective for intuition? He did acknowledge that even the scientific method is a bit more serendipitous, a bit more accidental, a bit more fortuitous than standard articles in Scientific American would say. He said it would, if they were honest, they would say, I was horsing around with the cyclotron the other day, and a wrench fell in, and we got the following result, and wow. Well, that's the scientific method. But he told me this when he, after saying, well, I'll leave a little room for that, he said, I do have one experience. I went to the supermarket. When I walked in, there was a great big banner on the wall saying, whoever is at the cash register when the bell rings will receive all of his groceries free. And something said to me, now there we are. There it is. What is the something? Something said to me, you are going to be at the cash register when the bell rings. So instead of getting one grocery cart, I got 2 grocery carts. And I went through the zone, I pulled down hams, and I pulled down turkeys, and 4 times as much as I wanted this. Got both of them, rolled up to the cash register, ring, it rang. I got my groceries free. How do you explain that? Now, he didn't have an explanation. He just simply reported. Well, that's the bind we're in, any of us, who claim that sometimes we get insights and we cannot explain how we got them, where we got them, or even who that or what that something is. Let's talk for a moment about a related theme. No one knows what creativity is. We're all working on the question in various fields, but we hear this word, he's creative, she's creative. Is there something we can discover in research that helps us understand what sort of people creative people are and where that creativity comes from? Let me try a passage on you. I'd like you to be phenomenological and introspective about this quotation, because I believe you will find yourself in a measure in these statements. Creative people are especially observant, and they value accurate observation, that is, telling themselves the truth, more than other people do. It is said that we have in our culture 1 or 2 words at most for snow. We talk about snow, slush. We make a distinction between snow and slush and hail, and that's about it. Eskimos, for whom this is a life and death matter, have 32 words for snow, different fine distinctions in snow. They often express part truths, but this they do vividly. The part they express is the generally unrecognized. By displacement of accent and apparent disproportion in statement, they seek to point to the usually unobserved. My 3-year-old daughter, after her first taste of ginger ale, said 2 profound things. First, it gives me stingy. And second, it tastes like my foot feels when it's asleep. I know poets who would kill for a line like that. Creative people are born with greater brain capacities. That may not be the same as IQ, by the way. They have more ability to hold many ideas at once and to compare more ideas with one another, hence to make a richer synthesis. They are by constitution more vigorous and have available to them an exceptional fund of psychic and physical energy. Their universe is more complex, and in addition, they usually lead more complex lives. They have more contact than most people do with the life of the unconscious, with fantasy, reverie, and the world of imagination. Calvin Taylor has done serious research, and there are two negative wonderful conclusions and one positive conclusion. The two negatives are that IQ, which we still talk about confidently, is a very inadequate measure even of what we most narrowly define as intelligence. And number two, that it is not the case, which most of us assume, that whatever you're born with IQ-wise, you are stuck with, and there is no way to change it or improve it. On the contrary, even that measure, even that particular set of gifts can be improved. Or, on the other hand, by neglect and atrophy, it can diminish. The positive conclusion is that it would be far more adequate, and he wished for a test that could be called perhaps the Taylor Totem Pole Talent Test. At least 6 categories apply to the question of our basic born intelligence skills. And the good news is that everyone is in the top 90th percentile. I didn't just say percentage, percentile of one of them. He is above average typically in 2 more. He is below average in 2, and in 1, he's probably very close to a disaster. So that all of us come out having both a tremendous strength, but also some weaknesses. What the educational process does in our generation is help you find out very early, usually in kindergarten, where your weaknesses are. And you don't sometimes ever discover where your strengths are. Well, I suggest you're in there somewhere. And Taylor's totem pole, he talks about 5 main clusters of talent. Academic gifts, there are people who just seem to generate success in the academy, and they're the ones who end up being teachers because, as the critics say, they can't do anything else, and I understand about that. Second, artistic talents. We're talking music, literature, dance, drama, painting, et al. But there are also the vocational school crafts and guilds that are coming more into prominence in our time. Decision-making skills. That's a skill. Some of you who go to Baskin-Robbins stand there for 15 minutes, then order something, and then change it. That's being indecisive. The psychiatrist says to you in the examination, do you have trouble making up your mind? And you reply, well, yes and no. Communication talents. And apparently there is some correlation between the ability to communicate and to listen. They seem to be correlative talents. Some people would assume the opposite. If you're a talker, always out there trying to tell people things, you don't listen well. A famous actor out of Hollywood, Charles Laughton, who called himself a ham, he could stand up and read a laundry list, and you would be almost hypnotized, no matter what he said. There are other people who could stand up and announce that the atomic bomb is about to go off, and you'd go to sleep. Then he talks about wisdom talents, the gift for assessing the gist of situations, seeing them whole, and even though you don't have a lot of data or knowledge, to make wise recommendations. This is where older people sometimes have the advantage. They've been over the road. We think of them as anachronistic, but they often have seasoned judgment. They don't know when you ask them a question about your computer, what you're talking about, but lay on them the overall concern you have, you will receive wise counsel. Finally, there is planning and forecasting skills. These show up in architecture and engineering, plotting of economic trends, etc. I think it was Santayana who said people who cannot remember the past are condemned to live it over. A planner, if he has 3 minutes to do something, usually spends the first minute or so planning how to use the other 2. Now, I want to say a comforting word in passing about a problem that surely all of you have thought about in your own academic careers. You may have been intimidated at some stage of your life by being taught that there's no hope for you if you're not a master mathematician. The more hard mathematics you can learn, the greater your chances of success. And this is even more now advocated on the ground that this is the essential background if you're going to be a computer whiz. I suggest to you that the evidence is overwhelming that each of us has different and inherited perspectives and skills and talents, and that mathematics may be the strong suit of your friend, but not of yours, and that you should not be in despair about that because there are other talents equally important, some would argue even more important, and that even the key to the universe, if we're talking about understanding and comprehending real life, may not be mathematics at all, but metaphor, which is to say the awareness that requires particularization and picturization and imagery, such as is the long suit of people in the humanities and in literature and in the particular sciences known as history and so on. So do not despair. We have a certainty in our scriptures. We are under amnesia, but not quite completely. We do have occasional wanderings and starings. But as certain as we live, the time will come when it will all come back with a rush. And we will know those whom we left, and we will know those really whom we, quote, met for the first time, quote, here. And that will be a day. That will be a day of light and truth. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.